I regularly get asked the question what my favorite thing to make is, and my short answer is fruit pies. I love fruit pies. They're simple in their construction in that it's really just pie dough and a fruit filling, but they can be incredibly diverse. I'm gonna show you how to make one that I really love that's kind of unique, and it's a pear pie. But not just any pear pie, a pear pie that has been infused with some bourbon and some lemon juice to really highlight the floral, fruity, sweet flavor of pears, while also making a really decadently soft and delightful filling for our pie. The first step in making a pear pie is making the crust. And in the recipe, you'll notice that we call for our double crust recipe, which you should find down below. I've got them here, and what you end up with are 2 discs of pie dough. We're gonna pop one back in the fridge because we're gonna use it to make the lattice for the top of the pie. And we're gonna go ahead and roll out this bottom one for the bottom crust. So let's get going. I'm now going to lightly flour my surface and unwrap my pie dough. And I'm going to roll this into a 1/8 of an inch thick circle. You'll see some people online say to roll the pie dough up on the rolling pin to then put it on the plate. But I have an easier trick, and that's just folding the circle of pie dough in half and then folding it in half again, and then simply unfolding it inside of the pie plate. Now that I've pressed my crust into the pie plate, I'm going to trim around so there's just a 1-inch overhang all the way around, reserve the scraps of dough, and fold it under itself and press to make a crust all the way around the edge that's just a little bit thicker than the bottom crust. So I have my extra dough here from trimming the edges, and I'm just gonna pop it back in the fridge and use it with the other dough when I make the lattice for the top of the pie. But now I have my perfect bottom crust right here. And if you look at the recipe, it instructs you to butter a piece of aluminum foil and put it on the bottom and then freeze this either for an hour or up to overnight if you want, and then just popping it straight in the oven. That prevents it from puffing as it bakes and creating air pockets in the crust. But another trick to do that we're gonna do today is just to blind bake it with some pie weights. And so I'm gonna put a circle of parchment paper in this pie shell and fill it with some rice that I've used several times as my pie weights to hold the parchment paper down and to keep the pastry from puffing and rising. So here's my circle of parchment and my rice. Beans work great too. Once you blind bake with them, you don't want to try to cook them and eat them. Just save them for blind baking. This is gonna go into a 350-degree oven for 25 minutes. And then I'm going to remove the parchment paper and the pie weights and pop it back in for another 5 to 7 minutes, just until the bottom begins to brown a little bit. The first thing we need to do before we start peeling and slicing our pears is to get our sugar mixture ready. And this is a sugar, spice, and starch mixture that allows all of the fruit juices that are naturally in the pears to congeal and set into a really wonderful thickened filling. And so in this bowl, I've whisked together a 1/2 cup of granulated sugar with a 1/4 cup of all-purpose flour. And the recipe calls for 1 tablespoon of instant tapioca. I didn't have that because I couldn't find it at the grocery store, so I added 2 tablespoons of cornstarch instead. It does the same thing. And then I also added a 1/4 teaspoon of ground cinnamon and 1/8 teaspoon of ground cardamom. The cinnamon gives a really familiar flavor to this fruit pie, kind of reminiscent of an apple pie, but the cardamom has an extra fruity, spicy flavor that lets you know that you're eating something very different than apple pie. And I think it complements the pears beautifully. You'll notice this isn't a really heavily spiced pie. Instead, this recipe was developed to really highlight the flavor of the pears. And so what the pear tastes like is what you're gonna get. Now that my flour and sugar mixture is combined, I'm just gonna set it aside while I work on the pears. I'm going to peel each of these pears, remove the core, and then slice them into 1/4-inch thick slices. My 3.5 pounds of pears are done being peeled and sliced, and so I've got them all in this big bowl. And the first thing I'm going to do is add 2 tablespoons of lemon juice. I just squeezed this a moment ago. And then the secret ingredient, 1 tablespoon of bourbon. This adds a depth of sweetness and flavor and complexity that is just, quite frankly, different than most fruit pies that you'll have. It doesn't taste super boozy. It's just a very slight, subtle flavor that really complements the deep sweetness of a pear. Okay, so I'm just tossing these to coat with my hand. You can use a spoon if you'd rather. And now I'm going to add all of the dry ingredients that we whisked together a few moments ago. And again, with my hands, I'm just gonna toss to coat the fruit in these ingredients. As it sits, the sugar in this mixture is gonna draw out a lot of the moisture in the pears. And that's okay. All of this is going to go into the pie shell. My bottom pie crust is done baking, and so I'm just gonna let it finish cooling off. And while it finishes cooling off, I'm gonna set this fruit aside to continue macerating in the sugars. We're going to next roll and cut the strips of pie dough to make a beautiful lattice for the pie top. You don't want to do this when the pie crust is still warm, the bottom pie crust, because then the butter in the pie dough on the top will melt and it won't be a really tight, beautiful lattice. So I'm gonna set this aside, I'm gonna let my crust cool just a little bit longer, and then we'll be right back to lattice our pie. Doing the lattice of a pie can be intimidating at first, but I promise it's not actually as difficult as it looks. So take the rest of your pie dough, and we're going to put it on our floured surface, and again, roll it out into a 1/8 of an inch thick circle. Now that we've rolled this dough into a kind of a rough circle or oval, I'm going to use this fluted pasta wheel edge that I have. It's a fancy tool. If you don't have it, that's okay. You can just use a knife. But I'm gonna use this to cut 1/2 inch wide strips out of this dough. You'll do the same with a knife if you don't have one of these. This just gives it a fun, jagged, but kind of perfect edge to each piece of pie dough on the top. I have my pie crust right here, and I'm going to pour the fruits inside. It is cooled off completely. And you wanna be sure to get all of the last bits of juices that are inside that bowl, and spread the pears around until it forms an even mound. It's okay for it to be a little bit higher in the center than right around the edges. Then starting with your 2 longest pieces of pie dough, you're just going to lay them directly across each other to form that cross. Take another strip of pie dough and lay it on top of one of the pieces parallel to the other. And the idea is that every time you lay down a new piece, you want the pattern of the cross section to be the opposite of the one before it. So this strip is going over, under, over. And I have found that it's easiest to work with 2s at a time. So I've laid down these first 2, and then I laid down these next 2. I'm now going to lay down ones that run parallel to the second strip of dough that was laid down. And simply pick up each edge and lift it up and fold it over. You're not gonna break the pie dough. It's okay. And now I'm going to repeat this process with each of my strips of dough. If you find that you run out of pie dough, one of these longer strips you can cut right at the seam, and this can be one of the shorter strips of dough we use around the edge of the pie. You'll notice that as I'm layering these, it's every other row is the one that requires you to lift it up in order to place a new row beneath it. If I'm laying down this strip, I know that I need to lift this strip so that it goes over this piece because it went under the previous piece. And that means every other strip is going to require me to do the same. So I just lift them up like so and lay them back down. Once the entire surface has been covered, just go around with a pair of scissors and cut off the extra overhang, and your lattice pie is ready to go. We're now going to pop this in the fridge just for 15 or 20 minutes to allow the pie dough to firm back up, and then we're going to brush it with our egg wash and sprinkle it with our raw sugar. All right, here I have egg wash that's made out of 1 egg yolk and 1 teaspoon of water. I've just whisked it together. And then here I have 1½ tablespoons of raw sugar. I'm going to brush the entire surface of the pie with this egg wash and then sprinkle this raw sugar onto the lattice crust. The raw sugar will bake and stick onto the lattice crust and make it extra crunchy and sweet which is really nice with the buttery, salty pastry that makes up the pie dough. Now that we're done with our lattice and we're done brushing it with egg wash and sprinkling it with raw sugar, the pie's ready to go in the oven. A few things to note. One, you want to put it on a baking sheet that's already lined with either aluminum foil or parchment paper. This is because some of the fruit juices are bound to come out of the pie and onto the baking sheet, and it will save you so much hassle later when you're cleaning. Another note, the outside of the pie is going to be done baking before the inside is, which means these beautiful pieces of lattice are going to be browned and crisp before the inside is done setting. And so that means in the last 20 minutes of baking, we're going to cover the pie with a piece of aluminum foil. So the pie bakes for a total of an hour and a half, but only for the last 20 minutes is it going to be covered. So I'm gonna transfer this right onto my baking sheet and pop this in the oven for an hour and a half. Once I pull it out from the oven, I'm gonna leave it to sit for at least 2 hours. It seems like a long time. It's kind of the bane of every baker's existence when it comes to a fruit pie, because you can't rush that process. If you do, the filling won't set completely, won't have time to cool completely, and you'll have a really runny pie. I promise it pays off to wait. See you in a bit. All right, my pie has been out of the oven for about 3 hours. Here I am with my wonderful piece, which you can see. It holds its shape nicely. The pear pieces are still kind of whole and intact, but once you try it, you'll see that they're really soft. All right, I'm gonna take my first bite. The crust is crisp from blind baking it before we filled it, on the bottom and on the top. And on the top, it's got this crunchy, sort of flaky, salty, and buttery thing going on from having plenty of time to bake, but also baking with the egg wash and the raw sugar. That adds the extra depth of color and the extra crunch, which is really a nice contrast to the inside. Because the inside is so soft. You can see that the pear pieces still hold their shape. They don't really break down per se, but they're coated in this really jammy pear juice, sugar, and starch liquid that make it taste just like a pie. And then lastly, I have to note that the bourbon flavor is just perfect. It's there, it's faint, it doesn't overwhelm, it's not boozy, as I've already said, but it does offer a depth of some sort of flavor that I assure you most of your guests probably won't be able to name, but they'll notice. It's deeper than vanilla, but it's present, and it's really, really good. The cinnamon and the cardamom are just right. They kind of draw your attention to the flavor of the pear while sweetening it and spicing it just a little bit. Altogether, this fruit pie is one for the books. If you've enjoyed what you've seen today and you'd like to find other videos like it, subscribe to the Southern Living YouTube channel. You're sure to find a ton of different things that we know you'll enjoy. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time. Bye.